When you came to hear a tiny speech I gave to a tiny group in January 2003 on a very cold day, you said to me, I need to talk to you because I need for you to understand more than you do. Because I was also very angry and felt very betrayed by the city. And hearing these stories like Talat's and Zora's and others, I felt in myself taking a very hard stand against things. And what I remember about that day, but I think I sat with you for an hour and a half and asked one question. Maybe you say I asked 2 or 3.
Maybe 3, but no more than 3.
Yeah. I began to understand, what Jeffrey Hartman and Dory Laub and others have written about as testimony, as an act of active listening, and in order to learn, not just in order to feel, but in order to learn. And what you taught me in that very complex interview was all the ambiguities that you felt as a young man who thought one day maybe I'll be a soldier, and how that came up again in you. And it was so hard for you as an intellectual, leftist, a human being, a person caught up in it and angry about it, to negotiate through those feelings. And I learned so much from that about the importance of holding on to ambiguity while you're feeling the feeling and as you're moving towards thought. And I wonder if you could just talk about that in-between space a little bit.
Yeah. I basically grew up, I was born in 1955 and grew up in the shadow of World War II. And my father would always say, well, marrying your mother was the best thing I ever did, but being in the Army in World War II was the biggest thing I ever did. And I was raised in the shadow of that, and I imagined that I might go into the Army as a young man. I mean, as late as high school, it seemed entirely plausible that I would enlist in some branch of the service. But along came the Vietnam War, and I almost had to unlearn everything I'd learned. That's what I felt. And it didn't stop with me. Both my parents became quite opposed to the war, although not initially, and not reflexively by any sense. But they came to oppose it strongly. And so I grew up, and as an adolescent, the formative experience I had was opposing the Vietnam War. And then along comes 9/11, and I think, well, we're going to have to protect ourselves, I'm a little too old to do this myself, but the immediate aftermath of 9/11, I felt like I was back in the world of December 7th, 1941. In a strange way, I felt right at home. I felt right at home. I was thinking, what could I do? What my wife was thinking, what could she do? And then within a few months, I decided we were living back again in the wind-up to the Tonkin Gulf resolution, where the president's lying away into an unnecessary war. So I got this incredible sense of vertigo, and I'm pulled back and forth. And I have a cousin who's a lifer in the Army. He did an extended tour in Iraq. Clearly scarred him very, very deeply, much more than the first Gulf War, which he was also in. One of my closest friends, who was in the World Trade Center bombing in '93 and then was on the upper stories and got out just before the first plane hit, in 2001 was killed with the Jersey National Guard in Iraq. So the whole thing was very, very close to me. And yet, in a strange way, even though my own ability to survive on 9/11 made me feel that, my war had come to me, just as it had come to my dad and my uncles in World War II. And finally, I'd known that I did fine. I lived up to the standard that my uncles would have set. But I couldn't take any joy in that for 2 reasons. The immediate reason was right after 9/11, the biggest thing I had was survivor guilt. Why am I alive and all these other people are dead? What did I do that was so great? All I did was run away. And in running for the rest of my life, I'll be haunted by the face of a woman who fell about 20 yards ahead of me as I was running. And she spun around on her back, and what would she have seen? 200 people racing towards her, and the entire debris of the South Tower coming up behind us. And she screamed, a horrible scream, her mouth was wide open. And for a fraction of a second, I thought, I know how to lift up heavy things. I used to be a garbage man. Maybe I should just try to hook my arm under her and pull her to her feet. But then I thought, I've just run around at least 3 tangled knots of people who've fallen all over each other. I don't want to get caught in one of those, because if I slow down for a second, I'll get hit. So I swerved past her and I kept running. And for weeks afterwards, I can't tell you, I beat myself up over the fact that I didn't stop, even though that's probably what got me out of the full flow of debris. So my survivor's guilt didn't help me. And then watching what was done in the name of 9/11 and watching one of my best friends die in an unnecessary war just seemed like such a waste. And I'm left hanging with this odd sense of duality. I lived up to the standard that I'd always wondered about. But it doesn't make me feel any better. It doesn't bring my dead friend back. It doesn't reverse 10 years of totally crazy national policies. Doesn't erase misdirection of our country in the most profound ways. So I never expected my own story to cancel out so much that was wrong. But the tension between the way I felt about what I lived through and the best of what I saw living through 9/11 and the misuse of it since then gnaws at me and angers me very, very deeply.
The last question that Arthur Yorkins asked of you in the panel the day of the performance was, what do you wish for the city of New York?
That's an easy one to answer. I wish for affordable housing so cops, construction workers, firefighters, teachers, and ambulance drivers can continue to live here and make it the great city that it is.
Thank you. Okay.
Zaheer, before you tell us your reactions to the performance, you were there that day, and I had the privilege of interviewing both Zaheer and his son Salman, whose eloquent testimony you just heard, who asked all those disturbing questions about loss, and a loss here and a loss there, and so on and so forth. There were so many of them. But before you tell us your reactions to the performance, tell us a little bit of your own experience that day.
I'm going to try and make it very brief because I've said it so many times, and I really feel that I really shouldn't be on this panel. Compared to the terrible things that have happened, especially after hearing Mrs. Hamdani's story. I happen to be working on the 65th floor, which is relatively low point, geographically speaking, on the North Tower. And I would say that I just put my head down and kept walking. The instinct for self-preservation was strong. The only thing is I was probably among the very, very last people to get out of the building because I have a polio-affected leg and I was having some problems in my back, and I'd seen my orthopedic surgeon a few days ago and he was waiting for the results to come out. I was wearing new shoes, and new shoes are always a problem for me because one shoe has to be, my left shoe has to fit tightly, and therefore it hurts, and the right foot is loose and it rubs against it. So I was in somewhat, the first 3-4 months are very uncomfortable. I was wearing new shoes. Combined with my physical disability, I was going very slow, but I just wanted to make sure that I get out. I know that when I reached the concourse, there were just very, very few people around. And the last of the volunteers and the policemen were saying, get out of the building, get out of the building. The building is about to fall. I'm skipping most of the intermediate part because you've heard it a few times. Well, I'll come back to it, but I think when I got out, I just took one look at the building, and that was the only look that I had at the building, and I said, this building is not going to survive. I was probably 150 yards away from it when it collapsed. Now, here is the thing that touches both sort of that trajectory that connects my narrative with my son's, is that day, we were supposed to have lunch together. Salman was working in the financial tower. I was working in the World Trade Center. And we used to have lunch maybe twice a week sometimes. We were very, very close to each other. And that day was one of the days that we were supposed to get together. And this part I'm mentioning because it wasn't in the play there. When Salman's train pulled in, he was expecting, of course, he didn't go up. He went out into the courtyard. And he said, all right, I'm going to wait for my father. And when his father didn't come out, as I told you, I was among the very, very, very last people, perhaps I don't know whether I was the last or among the last 3, 4 that came out. He saw everybody leave, and he didn't see me, and then the building collapsed. So he called a cousin of his who was living in Manhattan those days, but they're both out of the country now. And they both offered the prayer of the dead for me. And then he called my middle son, who was living in New Jersey. I think the telephone connections were, I think the landline connection was still good, although the cell phones were off. And he said, Mustafa, why don't you go home? Because I can't leave Manhattan, and you and Baba is dead, so I think you're the man of the house. Go and be with Mom. The performance, let me come back to the performance for a minute. It was excellent. I mean, it's, you obviously, I don't know whether these were professional actors or very talented amateurs. I can imagine Salman talking like that. He is much more eloquent than I am. There's no doubt about that. I am not sure that I have never felt any, and I feel guilty about that. I have never had any nightmares.
It's okay. It's okay. Yeah.
And I think I didn't have any nightmares because that part of the brain which creates those nightmares is the, I think, hypothalamus gland, which is programmed to let you fight or flee. And I was totally concentrated on fleeing. So there was no conflict. I fled. I fled. So I fled successfully. And there was, on the other hand, Salman had a lot of conflict because there was nothing he could do. He saw bodies come down, which is, I can't imagine how he would. I'm basically not a very, very tough-hearted person, so I'm glad that I wasn't there. But to see all that and not know whether his dad was alive or not, I think he had nightmares for a very long time. And I can understand. But I am sort of ashamed to admit that I have yet to have nightmares, although a couple of friends of ours, a good many Pakistanis seem to go into the medical profession, and many of them are psychiatrists. I said, don't worry, you will have them.
You'll get them eventually.
Okay, I haven't had them yet.
You know, Mary Marshall mentioned we're always being educated as oral historians by the people we interview. And I think of you as somebody who really educated me a lot because we always start at the beginning. I say, tell me where and when you were born, a little bit about your family. And your answer to me was, well, I think I'll have to start 600 years ago. And we did move through several geographies and centuries in the first part of our interview. But you talked a lot about your father, who was, I think you said, at first a socialist and an admirer of Nehru and a secular, and who became, after partition, somewhat religious.
Yes.
And you talked about your own relationship, as does Salman in his interview and in this testimony to Islam. And I wonder if you could say something about that evolving relationship and also about the perceptions of Islam post 9/11.
Yes, certainly. And I see a little bit of some kind of a parallel stream going on. People say that girls become their mothers and boys often become their fathers. I know very recently I had gone to England to see my 2 sisters. I'm the youngest of 3. and I thought I needed some TLC. And older sisters, I mean, in their eyes, I can do no wrong, absolutely, and I'm the perfect gentleman there is. But I also met an old friend of my father's, who was a banker, and when he came into the room and saw me, he gave a start. And he said, "My God," for a second I thought it was your father, because of course he knew my father from like around 1950, and until so yes, I am becoming a little bit of my father. And when my father, before partition, he was almost a socialist, but very westernized. So he was a socialist, but he did not wear the Hindu dhoti and the cap, but he wore a felt hat, and he said, "I used to dance in Charleston." But he did he came under the influence of a capitalist who was also very religious and a good man. But towards the end of his life, he was becoming extremely disillusioned with the practice of Islam as it was being done in a lot of places, particularly the Middle East. There was a time when, we would sort of take pride in our heritage and say, we are descendants of such and such and such and such. And after a certain time, it seemed to me that my father, it's very funny, people grow old and they become religious. My father grew old and he became non-religious, and the same thing is happening to me. He used to say Islam is a wonderful religion and Muslims are terrible people. I hold not that drastic a view, but I do feel that religions, and all religions, they've lost their place. There was a time when they were needed. We no longer need them. Human being invented God in his own image, a human being, or the human beings invented God in their own image. I don't think that works any longer. I gave up being a Muslim after I performed the Hajj, which every Muslim should do once in his lifetime. And one of the rituals in the Hajj are that you have to, after you throw ritual pebbles at Satan, you have to go around a certain place several times. And the crush is sometimes so much that if you lose your footing, you can be crushed to death. When my father performed the Hajj, he came back and he said, there was a group of big Sudanese who were linked arm in arm, and they didn't care who came in their way. I'm paraphrasing him. He said, I fell, and somebody grabbed me, and if somebody had not grabbed me, I would have been trampled to death. Believe it or not, virtually the same thing happened to me. I was going around that, but I have a bad leg, and my father was very athletic. He was as I told you, I think he was a boxing champion in his school days. But I stumbled, and I was performing Hajj with my sister-in-law and her husband, and they had their backs to the pillars, and she was close to me. She was not more than 6 feet away, but she lunged out and held my hand. But if she had not, I would definitely have stumbled and come to my death. I started thinking. I am an engineer, and correlation and figures and associations come easy to mind. I said, my goodness, 3 million people every year, they spend about 12 days there. So how many man hours is it? How many millions of dollars? With this kind of money, and God knows how many lambs and camels and cows are slaughtered. I cannot imagine why we still carry on this barbaric Abrahamic rite. I mean, I can't imagine that, but we do. And we could probably build a few universities, several hospitals, maybe even a nuclear power plant every year for that. I'm mentioning nuclear power plant with a tongue-in-cheek, of course. But to spend all this money to go around a black stone is, I think, its time has passed. I will say one more thing, because it's very interesting and touches about religion. One of the major religions in the Indian subcontinent is Sikhism, Sikhs. And the founder of the religion, Guru Nanak, he founded in, I think, the 16th century. And he wanted to amalgamate Hinduism and Islam, an idea which the great Mughal king, Akbar, propagated, never could succeed. He was too enlightened, too far ahead of his own times. But Guru Nanak tried, and one day he was having a discussion with a Muslim cleric. I don't know the story is apocryphal or is it true or whatnot, but Guru Nanak was reclining, and I'm not a Sikh, of course, but I'm still nominally a Muslim, but more as a brand. And his feet were pointing in a certain direction. So the Muslim cleric says, Guru Nanak Sahib, please don't point your feet in that direction because that's Kaaba, that's the place of God. And Guru Nanak immediately sat up and said, Maulvi Sahib, Maulvi is a word for a Muslim cleric, please give me the direction in which God does not exist so that I can spread my feet in that direction. Okay.
Just before we came up here, you were telling me, or we were talking about how the country has changed and your own experience here. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I could talk all day and all night about that. I came to this country in the 60s, late 60s. Country was obviously in a great flux. It was a great time to be a student. When I came here, my greatest regret was for having come as a grad student. I wish I had come as an undergrad.
Grad students have to work.
No, I could not imagine a place of learning so glorified. When I had my father was a well-to-do man. He could have afforded to send me to any university, anytime. And he was advised, I was the only son, he was very close to me, we were very attached, he was very fond of me. And the advice that were given to him were, Jaffery Sahib, don't send him to the United States. He's too young, he's going to become spoiled. Spoiled is a great word. What it means is that he may take up with a God forbid, a white woman and come to grief socially and bring shame to his family. So as an undergrad, I was very young too, that's true. But whatever my father said was law unto me, it's fine. So I did my engineering, and in those days, to do in engineering, I'm not overly praising myself, although I am slightly, but it was very hard to get into an engineering school in Pakistan. I think in today's New York Times, there was an article about the IITs and the Indian students. We can't touch a candle to them, of course. But when I graduated from my school, I was lucky enough to be accepted by MIT and Stanford, Cornell, and I had no idea where to go. My father had taken no interest in my postgraduate schooling. When he used to see me studying, putting 4 or 5 hours after school, he would say, my God, he's used the word makoda, which was an insect. He said, you guys are like insects. What are you going to do? Life is more than these slide rules and drafting boards. But when I came to this country, Vietnam War was a big thing. Women's liberation was a big thing. I know that I took part in a candlelit this thing for Martin Luther King, and I sang "We Shall Overcome." The country was generally more conservative than it is now, and yet I think it was more decent. There was not that rabid warmongering that I see now. And by the way, you mentioned about that Gulf of Tonkin, the spurious sinking of the ship. I think the United States has a history of sinking their own ships. Am I right? I mean,
Cuba?
Yeah, Cuba, exactly. Yeah. So we have this. What I can't understand, we have this huge body of liberal intellectuals and kind-hearted people, literally. I mean, you people are very kind-hearted. Why is there not some kind of a flow towards the heart of the United States? I mean, why are we, when I grew up on comic books. I mean, I learned English before I learned Urdu, although I became a precocious reader in both very early. But when I came to this country, I really felt that US government was governed by these values of uprightness and valor and independence. And it's still held to a great extent. But it seems to me that there's an obsession with having an enemy all the time. In other words, there's a good guy, bad guy obsession. It's almost like this country needs to be given a psychiatric treatment, the entire country. It's as if it must have an enemy. When we run out of enemies, we create them, and I think we are going to go into Iran very soon, which would be a terrible tragedy. I hope it doesn't happen.
I think we will stop. We will stop there. Well, maybe one last final question: is the world that you imagine or you would like to see for your children and grandchildren?
I feel extremely concerned about my children, like many other people's children. I think I saw the best of this country, and I don't think I will ever see that. If you may not recall, but in the mid-60s, this country was so prosperous and so rich that never had any country in the history of civilization been as rich, even relatively speaking, not even Rome. In fact, there was a French, what is his name? It'll come to me. The American, he wrote a book called The American Challenge. Sarvan Shriver, I think his name was. And that book was a call to arms to Europe and said, for God's sake, wake up, because if we don't wake up and catch up with the United States, we are all going to become vassal states. Look what we have done to this country. I mean, we have pauperized this country. From the greatest creditor nation in the history of mankind, we have become the greatest debtor nation in the history of mankind. What a shame. I feel very concerned about the future of my children and your children and your children.
Mr. Jaffery, you should know that your son's voice, I'm remembering when you said black and white and enemies, your son's voice is the voice of a diplomat who watched, one of our students analyzed his interview recently and talked about the contradictions he had witnessed in all the generations and how he looked on both sides constantly. And one of the most eloquent things he said, repeated here tonight, was, it's shades of gray. It's not black and white. And he's really helped our students understand something that you've been saying also in a different way. So I want to thank your whole family for being here and sharing your wisdom.
Thank you.
And I'd like to close. I think we're at a closing point. No questions? Anybody from the audience would like to speak or comment? We have a little more time. Marianne says. 15 minutes. Oh, okay. So we have 15 more minutes. Would anyone like to ask questions or make commentary on both the performance and the responses? Yes.
because, you know, they were making her accent stronger and so on. This, of course, is a performance of a very different kind, but I'm wondering if you might want to reflect on that alienation of inhabiting someone else's voice and the different kinds of ways that that can be done and ways in which you feel about it. I mean, we have the ranges between the kind of thing that she described and then an Anna Deavere Smith who inhabits herself so many different voices and is able to give voice to witnesses and embody their story. So there's obviously a huge range of different ways that that can be done, and I wonder if you could reflect on that.
Just to say, as a preface to that, when I talked to Indira Etwaru after I learned this was happening, she made the situation so that the names of the people who were performed were not included in the program, which I thought was very correct. Anyway.
No, you take it.
Okay, it's tricky for me to address on one hand because I felt so well performed. I learned about myself. It was really interesting. You know, it was like reading students' evaluations sometimes. You know, when you're a teacher, you'll learn things about yourself that you haven't noticed. At the same time, I know that in discussions around oral history at Rutgers, where I teach, I'm constantly arguing that what we need to preserve is the voice of the narrator, that the narrator is paramount, that you can't do just whatever you want with somebody's interview, that it really must retain some authenticity in terms of the context, in terms of the intended meaning, in terms of the intended usage. That, in this sense, I think oral history culture, which I encountered 30 plus years ago now, has a lot in common, it seems to me, with documentary culture and its attempt to be faithful to the words of the narrator, because the narrator is the most important thing going on. Digital mashup culture, where you can put anything together from all points of the compass, doesn't fit very well. And when I talk to my 18-year-old son about this, he's absolutely baffled at how I could feel this way. But I do, and I know that's something that I picked up in oral history, and I would still stick with fairly strongly.
You know, I was trying desperately not to make eye contact because it's like you're in a classroom and the teacher is about to ask something. You want to be sure that the teacher doesn't look at you. So as far as the performances go, I think I will just talk in context of my son and the person who I would say the only difference is Salman is more mellow. I mean, the person who acted for Salman's part was a little bit more like me than Salman. Salman is my.
I think that's true.
I may give you a little bit of history of his. When he was. When he was going to high school, he was going to what is supposed to be the most rigorously, academically top-notch school in Pakistan, which is Karachi Grammar School, which has the record of sending the largest contingent of students in a single year to MIT, incidentally. Yes, no, so he's but we had, when he came to this country, he came here and I put him in high school. I was in Poughkeepsie in those days. I couldn't afford to put him in a private school, so he went to this. And he came back and said, "Baba, they hardly teach anything. I think I'm going to go back to Pakistan." He was living with my parents, which I thought was a great training ground for him. My father was a better father to him than I would have been. But when he started college here. Marshall, you'll be surprised. He was very young. In fact, he was so young that he could not be accepted at a very good university after he graduated. And they wrote him a letter. It said, the average age of our applicants is 26, and you're just 20. So get a few years practice and come back and apply to us. This was the School of Diplomacy at Princeton, some school of, in any case. And of course, when he started working, he started earning money and he became a different person. He was no longer the professor kind. But while while he was going to school, he twice won a paid internship for summer where he would be a student counselor at Vassar. And he was counseling people who were 4, 5, 6 years older than him, constantly. So I mean, that's the kind of person he is.
Yes.
He is, you know, if you have a group of so many people and some kind of a group discussion goes on, and you have 4 or 5 different groups who are all having a different voice, he would probably be the ideal moderator. He's the guy. And I wish that he had not done his MBA. I wish he had done his doctorate in political science, which he wanted to do. But I guess it's too late now. Now he has to put bread on his table.
Never too late. Yes. Did you have a question? Okay.
I had a sort of related question. For me, the performance in this case was quite well done, and I certainly take your word for it that you thought it was very, very flattering in terms of your own voice. But what I found disturbing in this particular was the music, which I found very manipulative. The music, the sound. I found that was really an effort on the part of the filmmakers or the makers to stir emotion. Why does one have to do that when one has oral histories that are already, you know, loaded with emotion? So there was something really heavy-handed about the way that was put out. So I wonder if you would think that or not.
Anybody want to speak?
I thought the music was beautiful. I mean, it's interesting. I thought the music was beautiful. For me, it evoked passage of time, flights of memory. It got me. I wasn't performing myself, but it was interesting in watching that clip, right? And listening to those sounds again, it got me in a much more expansive, meditative mood than I would have been otherwise. It's going to sound morbid, but in some of the sounds that he coaxed out of his instruments of flight, I did start to think about, you know, the migration of souls and what it would have been like if people had gone up in ashes. I always said to my wife, you know, and she thought I was dead on 9/11. It took her 6 months to tell me that. Between the fall of the South Tower and when I finally got to call her on the phone, she said, for 50 minutes, I thought you were dead. I didn't see how you had gotten out alive. And I always said to her that, you know, if I did die, let's think that, you know, I came to rest somewhere east of Montauk Point. It's a beautiful point. I love the Atlantic Ocean. Wouldn't it be nice? And the sound of falling that was evoked by the music I thought was spectacular. At times, I thought the narration did a great job. At times, I wasn't sure the narration was doing a great job. But the music, funny, for me, was tremendous, for me.
Can I add a bit to it? I have exactly the same feeling. The music was amazingly good. I mean, it was. I'm not a kind of person who's sort of was lachrymose, but I felt like weeping. I mean, honestly, it was. So you may be the oddball there. Pardon me.
Yes.
I just had a quick comment that I think also in the video, we were hearing it as background music, and you probably heard it live, not as background music, which probably was a different experience. Am I right in that?
I can't quite hear you.
That in what we heard here was the music kind of as background to the narration, kind of happening at once, and live it was probably more of a concert and a separate thing. That
it bled into the different sections. I mean, my response was that the poet Carl Rocks, who's obviously very talented, we had to cut a lot of him out for this particular, and that was the element that the talking for people that I like poetry to come from the lips of those who we take their stories from. I think what they say is poetry. I think Salman's statement about the dust settling and 3,000 souls is as much poetry as you can find. And so I go for those beautiful plain passages. I came to love the cellist because he came from the Museum of Chinese in the Americas, where I worked for many years through the Columbia to build partnerships. So I kind of fell in love with him because of who he was. So the music didn't bother me.
But I thought it was just interesting that we were hearing it like twice removed. So there was the story, the live performance of the story, and then we were watching the edited video of the performance. So
yeah, it was maybe different there.
So I think there probably was a real difference.
It was I think it may have felt less intrusive there. And it also, I remember just finding out this was happening and being so terribly nervous about seeing it because I knew it would bring back all the emotion. And I wanted it to be good also. And, you know, the music calmed me and enabled me to move into that emotional space without feeling a jolt. So actually it worked for me. We have time for one more question and then we should end.
Thank you for the information. My question is to the gentleman that says that the Hajj experience has kind of like divided him from religion. Maybe I'm paraphrasing, but I think I heard you say that you're moving away from religion. Was it that Hajj experience or a combination of whatever? Because speaking of your experience of getting out of the tower, I just thought, you know, maybe I'm religious, that you were being guided to safety by some force other than your right shoe being too tight. And to hear you say after going around that I think I heard you say you were being more separated from your religious experience. Can you explain that?
I think I can, but first of all, I have to apologize. I hope you didn't mind my comment. I was, yes. Okay. You have a point there. My wife likes to say there is a purpose in everything, but I would like to stand it on its ears and say everything can be made to have a purpose, or you can look upon something and find an opportunity. No, I do not believe that there was a divine hand which guided me out, because then I would have to subscribe to the idea that the same divine hand caused 2,900 and whatever number of deaths. So I have to tell you that. However, the silver linings that were there, and there were many, was that Americans in general began to realize that there are worlds beyond the United States. There are people of cultures other than baseball and apple pie. So in a microcosmic way, I met some wonderful people. I was just telling Ms. Marshall there, I was praising her perhaps over profusely, and then I said, you know, I know that you Occidentals feel very, very self-conscious about being praised too much. And even my youngest one, who was more American than any of us, he gets very, 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 very agitated when my wife praises him. You know, she thinks he's Socrates and Apollo rolled in one, and he gets very upset. No, I honestly don't think that there was a divine guidance. I do feel that every religion, I mean, each individual who started the religion, just unbelievable individuals, but somehow the message got lost in translation over the centuries. I would say that.
Let me just add to it at the risk of, I hope it doesn't hurt anybody. I'm Jewish, celebrate Jewish holidays, children were bat mitzvah and bar mitzvah. And yet after 9/11, when I got home, I grabbed the Bible and I read some of it. I thought it would help me. It didn't make a really big difference. It really didn't. I thought, something's supposed to happen, I thought. I'll read the 23rd Psalm. And yet, I will tell you, I have in my whole life never been more choked up than when we walked into a memorial service a year later in Central Park, which was basically a gigantic concert, which drew on all the music and oratory of New Deal New York, of Franklin Roosevelt and Fiorello LaGuardia. And it opened with Fanfare for the Common Man, the radical composer Aaron Copland's composition, which was Fanfare for the Common Man long before it became the theme to CBS Wide World of Sports. And then we sang America the Beautiful, and the lines about alabaster cities, patriot dreams, more than self their country loved. I mean, at that point, and that was a very civic moment to me and not a religious moment, I just fell apart. I mean, I just started crying, and I could barely keep singing. Because to me, these were the things that had sustained me. And what I thought was great about the way they had sustained me and their tremendous potential was that they didn't demand that you belong to one religion or another. They didn't demand you belong to one race or another. They didn't demand that you belong to one political party or another. They were a large enough civic umbrella that I would hope all sorts of people could gather under it in all their differences. And that memorial service, far more than any one religious service, ethnic service, survivor, non-survivor service, anything like that, to me was tremendously moving. That large open space in the middle of Central Park holding so many different people, I think was tremendously helpful to me, far more than any religious experience.
I would like to just take the mic for a second, just for a second. As soon as you mentioned you're being Jewish, I'll tell you a little anecdote, which is, I
and
just
the
have
story
to say,
goes on.
Okay, right. I work in the Port Authority, but it's a niche program which has nothing to do with aviation, airplanes, or terminals, or bridges, but it does. The program provides financial aid to schools which are affected by the flight of aircraft. And what we do then is do noise abatement. And I basically direct that program now. I wouldn't use the word direct, but I'm a bit player in that. One of the things that I love about my job is contrary to many other jobs. When you do something, especially there are certain schools which have nothing. I mean, the schools are poor. Their library serves as a lunchroom and as an auditorium. There are many schools which are quite impoverished. On a couple of schools, I came to make the acquaintanceship of two very wonderful women. These were both schools, and I will not take the names of either the organization or them, but it's a Roman Catholic organization. The schools are poor. And my counterpart at the Federal Aviation Administration, who provides bulk of the aid, the Port Authority provides 20% mainly, and we do the administration. So I was sort of joking to her. I said, look, this is one of the fewest programs in the world in which a Muslim and a Jew conspire to help a Roman Catholic.
Oh, wonderful. I think we have to start to close. I want to give you a little passage, like a poem, that has inspired me throughout this long process of collecting stories, archiving them, translating them, transcribing them. Is a part of Jeffrey Hartman's Scars of the Spirit. Oral tradition, however monumental its aspiration, remains the art of assemblage. To reconstruct this shipwreck of fragments, these echoes, these shards of a huge tribal vocabulary, these partially remembered customs, needs a special love. Quote, nothing can be soul or whole that has not been rent, Yeats' Crazy Jane tells the bishop. Quote, break a vase, says Walcott, and the love that resembles the fragments is stronger than the love that took its symmetry for granted when it was whole. Thank you.